Oh, hello there.
Ranking all the Soulsborne Hero Ring games. I want to start off with saying there are no bad From Software games. Well, and starting off with Demon Souls, it's the first game in the series and fittingly so it is the worst. The game is set in Bolteria and has 5 different worlds with many subworlds within them, and the worlds themselves are fairly linear. World tendency is a mechanic only in Demon Souls, and thank God for that because it's a confusing mechanic that never gets explained. So the basic gist is that when in body form and you die, you will be transferred into soul form where your HP will be half and world tendency will shift towards black. And if that specific world goes to pure black, enemies will be stronger, but you'll gain more souls from them, basically just a harder difficulty. So, to avoid this, you have to play the game in soul form, so you'll always have half your maximum HP, which is just bullcrap. And the bosses are all gimmicky and there's always one way you can only beat them. For example, I have Tower Knight, you must hit his legs till he eventually falls down, you can hit his head for actual damage, or the Adjudicator where you hit his wound on his fat belly for him to go down, then hit the golden bird. There are many bosses like this, maybe like 3 which aren't gimmicky, but they mostly are. There are just some infuriating stuff like the limited healing system, because if you keep dying to a boss, which you won't except for like 3-4 bosses, you will run out and you have to farm them or buy them. And inventory capacity, which is just idiotic. With how many items in the game, it just doesn't make sense to add such a thing. Again, this was the first game in the series, so I have to cut it some slack, but it's just the fun factor with the game is so low, with it being the least challenging, with boring and gimmicky bosses, unnecessary mechanics like inventory space. And moving on to Dark Souls 2. The main problem with Dark Souls 2, well, there are many problems, but like the main one, was that it wasn't directed by Miyazaki, as he was busy with the Dark Souls Artorias of the Abyss, DLC, and Bloodborne. Don't get me wrong, Dark Souls 2 still introduces amazing stuff to the series, like power stancing, where you equip 2 weapons of the same type and in each hand and can use them simultaneously. Also introduced stat allocating, where you can change all your stats using a soul vessel. But these mechanics are just not enough to compensate for its flaws in level design and boss encounters. Dark Souls 2 level design is a big downgrade from Dark Souls 1 level design. We went from one of the best world designs to riding an elevator from a poison swamp to an area that's a castle sunken in lava. It just doesn't make sense. And don't get me started on those bosses, especially the runbacks. Iron Keep is the perfect area to describe everything bad and wrong with the game. Overwhelming enemies, largest aggro range ever, enemies play so delicately to screw you over, and Shrine of Amana. Shrine of Amana. There are 33 bosses in the main game, and 0 which are actually memorable. Adaptability, what can I say that hasn't been said before? Why does it exist? The game is slow enough as it is, and you are forced to level it up as the base running is horrendous, coupled with the most awful hitboxes in gaming. And if the game wasn't hard enough, every time you die, your HP bar decreases permanently until you use humanity, or a human effigy as it's called here. And trust me, you will die plenty of times, and most of the time it's not even your fault. Although its many flaws, From Software's many greatest hits were inspired by Dark Souls 2, especially Elden Ring. Moving on to Dark Souls 3, I just want to let you guys know everything from now on is at least a 9 out of 10. I know this is a bit controversial as this is many people's favorites, and rightly so. It improves almost everything from its predecessors. Fast and fluid gameplay, huge upgrade to boss quality, like the Abyss Watchers you fight them early to mid game, and they already cleared 99% of the bosses from the 2 previous entries. Adding fan favorite areas and characters, and even first to introduce skills, which is basically a poor man's Ash of War. So why is that only number 5 spot? Well, it's because of its world and areas. They all feel the same. Of course, there are some exceptions, but the most of areas have this grayish color, like grayish yellowish color scheme, so the areas feel a bit repetitive, if that's the right word. I also think they overdone it with the swamps that make you fat roll. They aren't necessarily only poison swamps, but deep sludge swamps as well. It has so many jarring areas that don't want to make me go back to the game, like Faring Keep, Smoldering Lake, Earthhill Dungeon. And why are there so many mimics? Like, there are more mimics than normal chests. Even the first chest you find in High Wall of Lothric is a mimic. It's not like the mimics are easy to fight, they are tedious to fight, and most of the time they aren't even worth it. I am very grateful that From Software have put a lot of effort into their bosses, otherwise this game would have been on the ropes. Moving on to Bloodborne. The gothic atmosphere here is unique and is executed perfectly. The fast aggressive combat with sidestepping and not trolling is just a match made in heaven. Most areas are fun to explore, with the first area being one of the best tutorial areas ever. The game removes the high risk, high reward element of parrying, as the way you parry is using your gun, meaning you have range. Bloodborne encourages and rewards you for being aggressive with a rally system, where when you take a hit, your health is decreased for a certain time, and if you manage to hit the enemy, you'll get a chunk of your health back. Personally, my favorite mechanic is the trick weapon, which is the game's version of two-handing weapon, but it transforms your weapon to a completely different weapon type. For example, the Moonlight Greatsword. At its normal form, it's just a straight sword, but its trick form is a greatsword. But it's not all good and jolly, as people tend to forget the bosses in this game aren't that good, and I think it's due to the old Hunter DLC, as the bosses there are amazing. But the base game only has like 4 to 5 bosses that are good out of 17, which is 30% of bosses at its highest. The game is almost a decade old, which is insane, and it's in dire need of a remake or a remaster. Bloodborne is the last game to have 30 FPS. And why did FromSoftware revert back to limited healing? Grass and Bloodfires are probably the worst two healing systems. The platform for this game is horrible for the sole reason: the chalice dungeons. They are the worst and add nothing to the game. Moving on to Dark Souls, game that really blew up the series, creating its own subgenre of games. It was my first Souls game, so it holds a special place in my heart. For starters, the world design here is amazing. All the areas link to one another, but they were kind of forced to do so because you can't work from the beginning. So if the world design wasn't so wonderful, it would be impossible to backtrack. The areas in the first half of the game are wonderful, and I've never been more addicted. But after Orange Theory and Snow, or like on Orlando, the game has a really large dip in terms of everything. Areas couldn't get worse, bosses as enemies, Lost Izalith is probably the worst area of all time. Nothing about it is good. It's one big lava pool with half dragons and a lot of them, like a lot. Then you're rewarded with the worst boss, the Bed of Chaos, a platformer in a clunky, slow-moving title game where your jump buttons bind into the same as running and rolling button. I know I haven't done anything except slander Dark Souls, but it really does deserve its praise. It's improved on everything from Demon Souls. It's home to iconic characters such as Solera and Shadow of Astora, and the when you get hit. I know I haven't spoken about lore this video, but the lore in this game is, in my opinion, the best. This and Bloodborne. I'll admit the combat is a bit sluggish and slow, not Dark Souls too slow, but it's not necessarily fast. And the fact you can only roll in 4 directions just adds to the whole clunkiness. In my opinion, this game is still a masterpiece. And moving on to Sekiro, it's definitely the least Souls out of the other games, mainly because there's no stamina bar, you only have one sword, and there's no co-op or summoning, but it still have some Souls-like elements. Sekiro is more narrative driven, and I don't mind that. I can actually finally understand what's happening in the game without having watched a lore video. But the main reason I and many others love this game is because of its combat system. Many other games tried to copy it but was never able to beat the original. The parry timings are pretty generous, and you're not always punished for mistiming the parry. Nothing beats hitting many successful parries in succession. It has to be like the most satisfying thing. But the combat has a steep learning curve, and the game is pretty hard the first time around, even one of the hardest games. Once you learn the combat, the game becomes pretty easy. You being a shinobi obviously means you'll be super agile and transverse the game quickly while using shinobi prosthetics and a grappling hook. You can't level up the traditional way by using souls, but the only thing you can level up is attack power by using main boss memories, health and posture by using prayer beads. You can either find them as loot or beating a mini boss. There's also a skill tree. Sekiro's area matches Japanese setting FromSoftware was trying to go for. The game is in the shorter side, but it's still like a 20 to 30 hour game. It's just relatively short. Just imagine if Dark Souls and Ninja Gaiden had a baby. That's Sekiro in a nutshell. And my favorite game is Elden Ring. Honestly, when it was announced that Elden Ring will be an open world, I was very skeptical. And I was burnt out from the amount of open world games that are coming out during that time. I was finishing up being the whole series, but I knew this was FromSoftware, so I kept my hopes high. And all I can say that FromSoftware delivered. Everything from amazing bosses, a beautiful open world, and beautiful areas. Elden Ring being an open world has its drawbacks, which you can never get stuck on a boss, so you can just go somewhere else and level up or even get OP weapons, so overall making the game one of the easier, at least for 75% of the game. Elden Ring adds many new mechanics, some being godly and some being outright useless. Having a map and being able to travel to every single grave helps a lot, and of course, one of the biggest additions is summoning ashes. That helps a lot if you're struggling in a boss, and if you summon them, they won't increase the boss HP like a typical summons would. I find that there are two main problems with the game. One being the replay value is low, as if you want to start a new save file, you have to spend like 1 to 2 hours collecting the flask, golden seeds, upgrade materials every time, which at least for me, it is a bit worth it, but it's still pretty annoying after a while. Second problem is the unbalanced mess the game becomes in the last quarter of the game. Starting from the fire giant till the end, bosses are most likely gonna one or two shot you, and with the recent release of the Shadow of the Earth tree, it's even more apparent. There is still a good thing coming out of this, is that the game forces you to learn the moveset of bosses and you can't make many mistakes. All in all, Souls games are amazing, and if you still haven't played them, I highly recommend you do so, and I would like to hear you guys' experience with which game you think is the worst or best in the series.